Welcome, everyone. This is the March presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Ben Woodbury with the Friends of History and will be your host today. We are especially happy to welcome the Friends of Archaeology as a co-sponsor for today's presentation. Eric Blindman, Director, Office of Archaeological Studies, has joined us online on behalf of the FOA, along with many FOA members who are also in attendance for the lecture. Their participation should make for a lively and informative question and answer session. For more information on the Friends of Archaeology, it is available on their website. The link will be provided in the chat room below. The Friends are quite excited about our own new webpage, which provides information on all Friends of History activities. All past and future First Wednesday online lectures will now be permanently available on this webpage through the First Wednesday Lecture Series link. Information also is available on the walking tours of historic downtown Santa Fe, a major initiative of the Friends of History. Our monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History with support from the New Mexico History Museum. We do, however, accept donations, all of which will go directly to support the lecture series and, more importantly, History Museum programs and exhibits. Should you wish to make a donation, just go to our new website and click on the donate button at the top of the page. So check out our website. The link is provided at the bottom of this video and in the chat room. Before introducing today's speaker, I want to briefly share with you information on next month's lecture. On Wednesday, April 7th, Cynthia Culbertson, a horse lover and author, will present Hoofbeats Through History, the story of the horse in New Mexico. As you know, the arrival of the horse with the Spanish led to a transformation of society throughout the Southwest, especially for the Native American population. The talk should be most interesting. The format for today's presentation will be somewhat different. Our first speaker will be Dr. Richard Ford, the Arthur F. Thornow Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of Michigan. His presentation draws on his work as research associate with the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in collaboration with Alison Colborn, the librarian for the Laboratory of Anthropology at the museum, and with Gary Hine, a volunteer with the Office of Archaeological Studies. Dr. Ford will discuss their combined research on Royal A. Prentice, a pioneer archaeologist in eastern New Mexico. Following the presentation, Dr. Ford will be joined by Ms. Colborn and Mr. Hine for a panel-styled question and answer period. Questions and comments can be posted at any time during and after the presentation on the YouTube chat room just below this video. Upon completion of today's event, both the lecture and the Q&A session will be posted on the Friends of History webpage, the History Museum's Facebook and YouTube pages, and the Friends of Archaeology Facebook page. One final note of interest before we begin the presentation. Growing up, Royal Prentice was inspired to pursue his archaeological work, in part by the discovery in 1908 of several fluted lance points, now known as Folsom points, among Pleistocene age bison bones in the region of Folsom, New Mexico, by a then unknown African-American cowboy, George McJunkin. McJunkin, a former slave who became a well-respected cowboy and amateur archaeologist, is now recognized for discovering one of the earliest records at that time of human habitation in North America. His contribution to archaeology and to inspiring Royal Prentice is especially worthy of note as we have just closed out this year's Black History Month. We now would like to welcome Dr. Ford and the rest of the research team. Dr. Ford?
Thank you very much, Ben. It is a real pleasure for us to present our research to you today. As I think many of you who are participating with us today know that the cultural life of Santa Fe would not be what it is today without volunteers. Many of you volunteer with different cultural organizations in Santa Fe, and we want to thank you very much for that. Today, however, we want to introduce one of the earliest volunteers for the Museum of New Mexico in the eastern New Mexico area. When he started finding archaeological sites and bringing them to the attention of the museum, there were two other people in different parts of the state who were doing the same thing, surveying for archaeological sites, bringing the information to the Museum of New Mexico. This is well before the Laboratory of Anthropology. They were H.P. Mira, who is well known in the Santa Fe area, Herbert Yao from the Doña Ana area, and then we have Royal Prentice, who was primarily from the Tucumcari area. Royal Prentice was born in Milford, New York, July 19th, 1877. He moved from there with his family to Lancaster, Nebraska. Well, going to California 2 years later, in 1879, they stopped in Las Vegas, New Mexico. They did not make it to California. They fell in love with Las Vegas. And it's there that Royal became the valedictorian of what was then called the Southwestern Academy in Las Vegas. He graduated, as I said, as a valedictorian. From there, he went to Purdue to study engineering. When he came back, he joined the Governor Otoro's militia, and that gave him his first military training. He then was back in the Las Vegas area, and he went to the law firm of Long and Fort. There he learned legal protocol, which was common in those days. He was a really smart guy, and he got into the New Mexico bar in 1898. When the Spanish-American War was breaking out, Teddy Roosevelt came to Las Vegas to encourage cowboys to sign up for the Rough Riders in the volunteer army. This is what Royal Prentice did as the second New Mexico citizen to sign up for the Rough Riders. In 1898, on May 3rd to be exact, he signed up, and his enlistment papers are on the left side of the screen. And you can see it was filled out by hand here in Santa Fe, even though he was a resident of Las Vegas. He came to Santa Fe to be sure that he could sign up. And it was in signing up that we got a lot of information about him as a person at that time. He was 5'7", fair complexion, brown hair, blue eyes. He worked as a stenographer and he was single. From there, he went to join the Roosevelt Rough Riders. They went to San Antonio for training. Now you have to realize that Prentice's hobby from high school on was photography. And when he went to Cuba, he was involved in 5 major battles in Cuba, including San Juan Hill. He photographed every one of these, and his photographs were published in the New Mexican Historical Review, and they're on file in the museum library downtown Santa Fe. When the war ended, he came back in the December of 1898. He had been wounded twice and he had yellow fever. So he went into the hospital in several places. He came back and he'd been promoted to a quartermaster sergeant position. You can see in the middle, he's wearing his Rough Rider uniform. And on the right, he's in camp in Cuba in a pup tent with a colleague who must have been his tent mate, who we don't know who he is. Now, as I said, he always had a camera by his side. The next slide is going to show that. After he left the Rough Riders, he was secretary to the Rough Rider Association in New Mexico, and he organized many of their conventions, as he did in 1950. And there you see he has a camera by his side. This was a very common posture for him. He worked for the railroad when he came back in 1902. The next picture is going to show a wreck of the El Paso and Northeastern train who he worked for as a brakeman. And here they are trying to upright the coal tender that had derailed someplace in eastern New Mexico. In eastern New Mexico, there was no town yet of Tucumcari. The railroad workers slept in tents along the right-of-way, and then as the track was laid, they would move westward with the track. So they moved to eastern New Mexico, and here they resided in a little town that they built on their own, and it was no more than tents. And at that time, what was to become Tucumcari in 1907 was called Ragtown. Ragtown because everyone was living in these pup tents. Well, already this Spanish-American veteran was living in Tucumcari, 1902, continued living there And he was a first citizen there. He was already a lawyer in the bar of New Mexico, and he had many appointments there. He became an assistant mayor in what became Tucumcari in 1907. In 1908, President Taft appointed him as the federal land registrar, which he had until 1914, where he distributed land to these people who were coming to New Mexico by train to claim federal land that was being given away free. So as it turns out, Prentice was a very successful attorney in what became Tucumcari, and he ended up by 1910 having 12,000 acres of ranch land, the same number of cattle distributed in Quay County. As a citizen, he was also very active. He became in 1910 a 32nd degree Mason. He belonged to 5 Masonic temples, including Santa Fe. He headed up the Boy Scouts. He was a member of the Knights of Columbus, of St. Anne's Church. He was the head of the Republican Party in Quay County, but at the same time, he organized the Prohibition Party in Quay County and worked hard to get the new state constitution that was being written to outlaw the sale of liquor in the state of New Mexico. Boy, you can imagine how that would have gone over. Well, we had the train coming to New Mexico in 1902. We know about Prentice being a wealthy lawyer, being a large landowner. The other thing that we're now going to learn about was that Prentice had a hobby of photographing archaeological sites. He surveyed for sites, both encampments as well as architectural sites, and he was in love with rock art. And he photographed lots of rock art. The Museum New Mexico has over 9,000 photographs. Many of them, as Gary will tell you, were glass negatives that Gary's converted into pictures that are on the internet. So this was our man in the beginning of adulthood, Mr. Royal Prentice. Now, he was already surveying in eastern New Mexico. By 1918, the state brought General George Goethals, who was the head of the Panama Canal project. They brought him to New Mexico to help site the location of a dam which became the Conchas Dam in the 1930s on the Canadian River. When he did that, he had Prentice come and assist him in finding the location for that dam. Let's look at the next slide. Okay, here we have him with his wife Louise in the middle. She's with their daughter Florence, and the other picture are of his two sons, Sylvester and Lawrence. Now, this is a big panel in the Newkirk area, and he did a real no-no in his photographing of the petroglyphs. I think you can all see what they are. It's something that we tell all of our volunteers not to do, and that is to chalk in the petroglyphs. He did it to make them come out better on the film that he was doing. So here he's chalked in these petroglyphs in Newkirk. And as I say, that's a no-no. There's a picture on the left with him, with his daughter, and his wife and the daughter on the left, and then another woman who I don't know who she is. Let's have the next slide, Chris. This is Archaeologist dam that he worked with General George Goethals to situate where the dam would be, where the Conscious River came into the Canadian. Next. The Canadian flood pool had a lot of archaeological sites. Most of them, if you can see the pictures, you'll see an ungulate on the left, and then you'll see other ceremonial figures on the right. Those are still visible today, but many petroglyphs are on the bottom of the flood pool at Conscious Dam. He tried to get the contractors to avoid as many as the petroglyphs as they could, but we still lost quite a few. This is one of the first sites he visited. This is called Rocky Dell and is in Adrian, Texas, on a tributary of the Canadian. There's a lot of rock art there. This rock art was first discovered when they did the survey for the railroad across the panhandle of Texas. And these were first published in 1856 on the railroad survey. They're an interesting group. These are, they suspect, are probably Comanche, but they are an elaborate array of different petroglyphs. These you can go and visit with permission of the ranch owner. Next. Another area that he surveyed extensively was the Pecos River Valley. He surveyed from Puerto de Luna downstream on the Pecos up to the state park. Along the way, he found just many, many petroglyphs, and he found several masonry sites like you see on this one on a ridge above the Pecos River. You can see that he was already getting lab numbers from the Museum in New Mexico. There's one of the early lone ones, 508. Next. The place that he found with the most petroglyphs, well over 2,000 petroglyphs and other sites, was the Pintado Arroyo in both Guadalupe and in Tejares counties. Here's another site on the left. It has tumbled down. We have more chalked in petroglyphs on the middle. And then we have his handmade site form. He was using his own site forms well before Mira came up with the famous Mira cards that were part of the site. I know that this is hard for you to read, but there he has the location. He has the nearest drainage. He has the description of the site if there was architecture with it. He has the pottery that he found there, any artifacts, and yes, his beloved petroglyphs he recorded. So that this guy was trying to do things the right way, even if he was damaging the petroglyphs with chalk. Next picture. Here's the famous Mira card. This was prepared by Prentice in 1933. And you'll see again the influence of Mira on Prentice. Mira taught him the different pottery types throughout eastern New Mexico. He would then record those on the cards and gives us a record of what he was finding. Next. The only excavation he did was influenced by McJunkin, and those were Pleistocene animals. He found the site of a buried mastodon in the Pecos River bottom. And you can see these guys are all dressed in suits and excavating on a Saturday or a Sunday. While they were there, they also found other artifacts. And these are either Clovis preforms or some kind of a Llano point that they found in the vicinity of this mastodon. His second excavation was at the San John site in southern Quay County. It's another famous Pleistocene site with Pleistocene animals in eastern New Mexico. Prentice was thanked by Johnson, who had a Smithsonian monograph about the site, where he thanks Prentice for participating in the excavation. Next picture. He was influenced by Mira in another way. He worked on the ethnogenesis of Chupadero pottery. Chupadero pottery he found in almost every site that he surveyed in the Pintado Arroyo. This suggests that many of those sites, well over 200, were probably occupied by the Humanos Indians, who were very numerous, though they were also called the Tompiros, and they seem to have stretched their inhabitation from the Rio Grande over to the Pecos River. Next. The Bell Ranch is the next place where he did a lot of survey. Here he found many, many petroglyphs, and you can see the petroglyphs had a lot of ungulates, and he photographed these on the Bell Ranch. This one is on the western side of the Bell Ranch in the Newkirk area. Next. This is Zora Spring in the northwest corner of the Bell Ranch. I think many of you are familiar with the Bell Ranch. It's one of the largest ranches in New Mexico. Here you see a lot of abstract petroglyphs that he photographed. Next. On July 4th in 1933, he went to visit Professor Holden from Texas Tech, who brought students over to excavate the Glorieta site, which is now known as the Arrowhead site on the Pecos National Monument. You can take tours out there if you sign up by calling the Pecos headquarters. Here you can see that they had just finished, the students had just finished roofing the kiva and reconstructing it. That's all gone now. All that's left is one beam over the kiva. Next. This is a very controversial one. When he was surveying on the Pecos, he went to Hidden Lake, which is just outside of Santa Rosa along the Pecos River. Hidden Lake you can see on a map. That land has just been sold, so we can't get to any of these sites unless we get permission of the new landowners. However, Prentice told Stanley Stubbs at the museum about his finding of these petroglyphs. The one that he found first is the picture on your left. Louis Ewing, who was an artist in Santa Fe, he went out and made a silkscreen copy of this. Of course, he took artist license with the reconstruction of this because so much had weathered away or had been vandalized. Now, why is this controversial? Some people think that this was done by Boy Scouts. I took a copy that Allison gave me of Louis Ewing's silkscreen and brought it to Hickory Apache elders because it was claimed that this was done by the Hickory. I showed the Hickory and they recognized some of these as being part of their religious pantheon, such as the eagle in the middle, the bison on the left, the snake on the bottom. These, they said, how would the Boy Scouts know about these? They had never been published in 1930 when the Boy Scouts were to do this. So the controversy remains, do we listen to David Gebhardt, who recorded this site in an article for El Palacio, or do we listen to Hickory elders who recognize these as part of their religious pantheon? Next slide. The other thing that Prentice was interested in was Coronado and his presence in eastern New Mexico. Now, his concern was, how did Coronado cross the rivers so that he could get to Quivira in eastern Kansas? And it's remained a question that historians have asked many times. Almost every historian who's worked on Coronado has come up with a different explanation for the route that Coronado took across the grand grasslands to the east. The latest contributor to this is Richard Flint. Next slide. Well, here are two maps. One is Prentice's map. He was a very good cartographer, as you can see from this map on the right. When they went out, he brought a group of Boy Scouts with him, and they went down the canyon that goes from the Pecos ruin. You can still follow that on a paved road today to the top of Row Mesa. And then you go down Blanco Canyon to the Pecos River. And that's the route that he took. He felt that they crossed the river to the north, but that wasn't his big concern. His concern was, how did they cross the Canadian? He used deductive logic to figure that one out. He decided that the Canadian River had so much quicksand and not an abundance of wood that you could use for building a bridge, that they had to have crossed just south of where the Mora River ran into the Canadian. On your picture, that's at that Y that you see on the top left-hand side. That's the area where Prentice thought they crossed to get the grassland on the other side. Next. He then proceeded to take these Boy Scouts in a Model T Ford truck that the Boy Scouts owned, and their bedding, you see, hooked down. And the truck was called Columbine, and Prentice took them on this tour, recording petroglyphs along the way. In 1936, Prentice wrote a book that's very rare to find now, and that's what's pictured on the right side here. Gary went to the University of Texas in Arlington, which has the only copy that we were able to locate and that Allison could find doing her archival search. And Gary got it, got permission to duplicate the pages. So we now have a copy in our lab library here in Santa Fe. thanks to the good librarians, the University of Texas, Arlington. Next. Along the way, the Boy Scouts went with Prentice up David Hill, which is located on Route New Mexico 39. You go to the top and there are all these stone outcrops and they're filled with petroglyphs, one of which you see here, again with lots of ungulates and with serpents on it. Next. Here are a couple more that came from there that Prentice recorded and photographed. And as you can see, he was still in a habit of chalking in these pictures. Next. Another thing he did was to return to the Canadian to look for shelters that had pictographs. This is one that he found at Conan Spring, just across the border into New Mexico. It's a Kiowa Apache legend that shows them hunting a bison. You see that on the left. They were stealing horses. You can see horse tracks indicating that. You can see them with holding a shield. You can see them with their bonnet riding a horse. Here on the right is the shelter where this pictograph is still found. Next. There were a couple of other pictures. He was a good student of ethnography. This guy was a very intelligent, wealthy lawyer. And his hobby of getting all of these is incredible. And so these, he felt, were done by the Comanche. And here we find a warrior with his shield, known as shield figures, a Comanche guy on a horse hoofs, indicating that they were stealing these horses. This is another one that he found. This one is not from the Canadian. This is from the Sombrero Gap ruin in the Pintado Arroyo in Guadalupe County. And here we have a couple of things. We have a shield. We have an animal whose tail is tied up to the shield. And then we have a parflash, which is a very common carrying container that the Plains Indians used. Next. Here's another one from the Canadian. This is a stylized mountain sheep, again, that was pecked to make, and then Prentice chalked it in to photograph it. Next. Well, go back one. This they called a snake dance. Whether this was made by Pueblo Indians visiting on the Canadian or whether it was Comanche is unknown to us. This needs a lot more in the form of a study. These are both rattlesnakes of some length that this guy's holding up. Next. Prentice did a lot of traveling with his family around the state. He did a lot of trailer camping. So with his station wagon, he pulled a small trailer that the family camped in. And he photographed lots of scenes, not just archaeology sites on these tours. Here is one that I put in for your appreciation. He went to the top of Hermit's Peak with his boys to photograph the hermit on top of Hermit's Peak. If you never saw the hermit before, now you're seeing him today. An interesting character. Next slide. Prentice and his wife are buried in the Memorial Park in Tucumcari. They had lived their whole lives from 1907 until her death in 1882. Now, if you will look on the picture, you will find something interesting. It says that Prentice was born in 1882. We know he was born based upon lots of evidence in 1877. Yet confusion comes when people go and look at his gravestone because it gives a different date for his birth. Next slide and final slide. Well, Royal Prentice is a long forgotten amateur archaeologist in New Mexico. However, he deserves to be remembered for his contributions to Eastern New Mexico archaeology. He recorded over 1,000 new sites, numerous petroglyphs, spectacular pictographs, and over 9,000 rock art photographs. So we wanted to introduce them to you and to acknowledge the value of trained volunteers to the cultural life of New Mexico and the importance of volunteers to the early history of the Museum of New Mexico that opened in 1909 when they were already recording archaeology, and the Laboratory of Anthropology that Mira and Stubbs were so intimately connected to that opened in 1931. And I thank you.
So Richard, thank you very much. A fascinating individual, clearly really struck by how wide-ranging his interests and his successes were throughout his lifetime. I also want to thank, before I forget, all three of you, Richard, Allison Colburn, and Gary Hine, for the hard work that went into exploring Royal's life and the level of contributions that he has made to archaeology. Perhaps to start off, perhaps you could, if there's a story in terms of how it was that you came about to take on this task, and where are most of his resources housed at this point?
Well, I'll start with the first part of your question because I'm the one that got us off the ground. I was in Dee Dee Snow's office in the basement of the laboratory, and there were a pile of very old mirror cards sitting there. And I thought, wow, those are pretty ancient looking. So I went and looked at them, and they all had the name of Prentice on them. And I thought, who the heck is Prentice? I've been doing archaeology in New Mexico since 1962, and no one ever introduced me to Royal Prentice. So from that, I followed up to find out who he was. And I got in touch with Allison, and I said, can you help find information about him? Which she did. And then we found all these photographs with the forms that he had filled out that were in the library of the lab. So I asked Gary, can you take a look at these photographs and try to straighten out and clean up these glass negatives, which he did very ably. So that's how it all started.
I mean, Dick did the hard work. The photographs and the other things, they were the fun work. Dick did all the writing and thinking.
He did the heavy lifting.
I think it's wonderful. I think it's great how you all were able to work together and leverage your skills to bring out a truly meaningful story. It appears that much of the work that he recorded was in the 1930s. Given that he was there in Tucumcari and was doing a lot of work in and around Pecos, is there any sense that he engaged with Kidder and while Kidder was doing the archaeological dig at Pecos, and of course, you know, that was such foundational work for archaeology, and there were also that was the time of the Pecos conferences. So although he was an amateur, I wondered how much engagement he might have had.
Yeah, that's easy to answer. First of all, Kidder and Prentice did not get along. Prentice thought that Kidder was too narrow in his outlook for archaeology in New Mexico, that he was ignoring Eastern New Mexico archaeology and wasn't surveying enough of Eastern New Mexico to tie it in to Pecos. The other thing is that Prentice did attend the first Pecos conference. When the report was written by Kidder, Prentice was not very happy. And so he was upset that what he had presented at the meeting was totally ignored by Kidder. So Prentice turned around and rewrote part of the Pecos conference report, making it Eastern New Mexico. And that was never published, but it's in the library of the Chavez Library in Santa Fe.
And so the heated dialogues of archaeologists at very early points. So I can imagine. For those of us who perhaps don't have as much background, could you talk a bit about Mera and his role and contribution and his importance, with embodied, I believe, in the Library of Archaeology.
Dick, do you want me to take that one or?
I'm not going to talk anymore.
Oh, okay. So H.P. Mara was one of the first people that worked out of the laboratory of anthropology, but he actually came to New Mexico to set up a tuberculosis hospital with his brother Fred. And he was actually very involved with the Friends of Art and Friends of Indian, I'm blanking, but working out of the Museum of Art. So before the Laboratory of Anthropology was even built, he was part of the Santa Fe scene and the Museum of Art. And Mara is today still consulted regularly for his work on pottery typology. As you heard during the lecture, Prentice came and consulted with Mara and learned about identifying the pottery types in eastern New Mexico. So H.P. Mara is still consulted today, and in fact, the Archaeological Society of New Mexico just a few years ago republished 11 technical series bulletins that were prepared by the Laboratory of Anthropology as a technical series, and then reissued it as a monograph. And that just shows that here we are in the 21st century, and Mara's work from the 1930s still has an impact and influence, just as Alfred Kidder's work does. Oh. So Stubbs worked out of, Stanley Stubbs worked out of the Laboratory of Anthropology, H.P. Mara, and Alfred Kidder. They all have this history and connection with the Laboratory of Anthropology.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. We do have a question, and it's for Richard. So, and of course, it may apply to you as well. Have you seen many of the petroglyphs that Prentice photographed?
I've seen some, but Gary and I were going to make a couple of trips to go, especially up that David Hill, because there's so many that are up in that area that Prentice photographed. And we've seen these. Gary and I have done survey of petroglyphs just between Interstate 40 and Vaughn on a big ranch down there, and it is filled with these ungulates. And yet we're seeing in a lot of Prentice's photographs ungulates of a similar style, but probably a little earlier than what we had surveyed. So I leave it to Gary to respond to that.
Well, the Newkirk site, if I remember right, is about maybe 5 miles north of the ranch that we were on. So, I mean, it's a large area that probably could rival the Galileo Basin in terms of NMHM.
Uh-huh. That's wonderful. I know most of the petroglyphs are predominantly Plains Indian, Utes, Comanche, Apache. Did I see that correctly in terms of what Prentice was discovering?
A lot of them are earlier than that.
Okay.
There are a lot of the petroglyphs that are in different archaic time periods.
Got it.
A lot of what you're seeing that he was photographing are developmental period petroglyphs with just lots and lots of animals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Let's see here. So I will ask Allison or Chris Are there any other questions we've missed that we would like to present?
I would like to make a comment about the chalking. There is, well, no, I mean, it's something that we've learned not to do because it leaves trace minerals and things like that that make it difficult for additional science to happen at a later point.
Okay.
But there is a panel on San Cristobal that was chalked by Prentice, and you can't tell it today. But I have a feeling that if you applied some microscopic science or something like that, you would find residual pieces of chalk deep in some of the grains. But the whiteness of the original chalking is long gone. I mean, it's not a commercial to chalk, but it's an interesting thing that I've observed.
Uh-huh.
Mm.
All right. Any last comments from our panelists or our guests? Eric?
Yeah, I think the value of the archive that Prentice has left behind is absolutely remarkable. It's one of those things that could easily end up in someone's garage somewhere, one or two generations down the line, so that far removed, it's just a box of old photographs. And I guess one of the things that I just want to make everybody aware of is that many times some of the most important historical documents we have can exist in collections like those of Prentice. And that if they get into an institution, if somebody like Allison has the incredible determination to track things down and to make sense of them, they can yield. And again, Santa Fe focused, the Laboratory of Anthropology focused, the Museum of New Mexico focused.
Yeah.
There's areas of the state of New Mexico that were the favored and favorite landscapes of so many people who may not have the connections to make these things, to get these things preserved. And that's one of the points that I'm really struck by. And if they get preserved, then it opens up the opportunity for this incredible research that Richard and Allison and Gary have pursued. So I want to congratulate everybody involved for the foresight and the diligence to take something that was preserved and give it context and meaning. So thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you. One of the things that I could add in terms of the work I'm doing in the library is, since bringing up the new library system in 2014, which is web-based, I'm going back through and recataloging or rebuilding the database in many instances, but making the context of Eastern New Mexico often is referred to as plains or high plains. When it's Paleo-Indian or archaic, for example, I'm ending in geographics like the Llano Estacado as an organizing element to make it easier to pull out the material. So you can pull it out by time period, but geographic also. And when specific native groups are discussed within archaeological reports, I am putting that information in also. So the whole idea is to just make it much more easy to search and pull that material out, everything that relates to one another. But I just thought I would throw that out there because a lot of the Llano Estacado, Eastern New Mexico, Panhandle region archaeology was very disparately referenced as plains, or it would be Texas Panhandle. Well, the Panhandle, of course, crosses into Oklahoma. So paying a lot of attention, and I do a lot of cataloging now, you know, like Pecos River Valley is an organizing element because it's about landforms is where these sites show up. So all of that is becoming an organizational element, making it easier to research, at least in the catalog. And I just thought I would throw that out there, that working with people like Dick and Gary and all the researchers, every time somebody comes in and asks me for something like mescal roasting, all of a sudden I discover mescal roasting is important. Well, how is that important? And that ends up in the database as a searchable element. So, you know, it's really a team effort. It really is. It's a lot of interaction between all of us is what makes this all happen. And Dick did all the heavy lifting. Let's be clear on that.
Your cataloging sounds fascinating. Is that available through the MIAC webpage or through?
Yes, it is, and it's got its own unique URL, and each of the records, like all of the digitized Royal Prentice materials where it's available electronically, all those open full text right out of the catalog. And I can put the catalog, the database URL right in the chat if you'd like.
That would be wonderful for anyone that might be interested in perusing that. So,
sure.
Yeah. So again, I want to just piggyback on Eric and just thank you, the three of you, for taking the time to make this presentation. It's been fascinating and most informative on a number of levels for us. You know, I wish you well in your continued researches once we come out of COVID. So,
yes, thank you.
Indeed. For our audience, again, I want to thank you for participating and remind you that this presentation will be posted on a number of web pages, the Friends of History, the Friends of Archaeology, and the History Museums, both Facebook and YouTube pages. And so feel free to revisit that and to peruse some of the other lectures that we have had or will be having in the future. Again, Eric, thank you for joining us. Appreciate that, and feel very fortunate to have the Friends of Archaeology as a co-sponsor for this presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dick.